Okay, so this is part two of chapter two, um, and in this chapter we attempt to define terrorism. But before we can define terrorism, in the book, Martin makes a distinction, and he says that terrorism is not synonymous with guerrilla warfare. And what he means is that in guerrilla warfare, revolutionaries historically attacked much stronger enemies through hit and run tactics, and these tactics involve use of force against um, the rival's military. Terrorism, particularly in this day and age, has been utilized against the civilian population and against innocents. So, in order to gain the greatest impact, terrorists use the violence against civilian targets, innocent civilian targets, as opposed to guerrillas who generally would do hit and run and attack the rival armies as opposed to civilians. Okay, so at first glance, defining terrorism, it seems like it's an easier task than it really is. And in the book, he talks about, and in most books, there is an ongoing debate about defining terrorism. In 1964, in a Supreme Court decision about obscenity, Justice Potter Stewart wrote that it was difficult for him to define what obscenity was, but he said, and it's a famous quote, "I know it when I see it." And so, for most folks, terrorism is difficult to define, but when they see the acts, or they witness them, or see them on in the media or on TV, they immediately are able to discern and define the act as terrorist or terroristic. But again, when we use the term terrorism and we're using it to define it, it depends on which side of the equation that you're observing it from. If you are from the weaker side, you're going to describe the people that are perpetrating the act as freedom fighters, and if you're on the other side, again, we're gonna say that they're terrorists. So, in the book, he has a sampling of some formal definitions, and so government institutions and scholars have developed their own definitions. So the government might use one definition, and scholars or academics might use another definition to define what terrorism is. Some distinct aspects of the definition and their authors are that terrorism does not have to be based on a violent act. The threat of violence may be enough for the creation and exploitation of fear. That comes from Bruce Hoffman. He's a famous author. Terrorists target innocent people. That comes from Walter LaCour. And terrorism instills fear in the public at large. And that comes from a lot of people. Walter Reich has used that in his definition. And ultimately it seeks to effect political change. And of course, that comes from Brian Jenkins, another scholar in the field of terrorism studies. Hoffman, LaCour, Reich, and Jenkins, those authors are all cited throughout the book, their works, and Martin uses their works extensively throughout the book, so that's why he talks about them. The most common feature of formal definitions is the use of force is considered illegal. The actors are subnational. The methods are unconventional. The motives are political, and the are directed at soft targets, and are aimed at influencing a larger audience. So these are some of the things that are common amongst all the definitions. One of the things that is probably the most common in all of the definitions are that the attacks are directed at soft targets, meaning civilians. So that has been a common theme among terrorists throughout the last 15 or 20 years. And we see it, it's a trend that has become more and more, I hate to use the word popular, but popular amongst terrorists. So again, to just review that, the common features of the definitions are the use of illegal force, subnational actors, unconventional methods, political motives, attacks on soft civilian and passive military targets, and acts aimed purposefully affecting an audience. The unconventional methods, that one was a belief, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on, that terrorists were going to use different weapons such as biological, chemical, um, nuclear weapons. But the last attacks we see here in Europe and in the United States, the weapons have been quite conventional. Small arms and automatic weapons have been the weapons of choice. So although they worry about unconventional methods and weaponry, it has been quite conventional, and it has been pretty devastating in the use the methods that they've used. Okay, so here in the United States, there is no single definition has been adopted to define terrorism. The Department of Defense, the U.S. Federal Code, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the State Department all have different and varying definitions that they use to define what constitutes a terrorist act. The new president might come in and ask the Justice Department to develop a universal definition. We don't know that, but as of today, there is no single definition used by all government agencies in the United States. So now we'll talk about some of the definitions. Some of them are in the context, they're similar, some use different verbiage, and some add different acts in order for the United States government to prosecute. So for prosecutorial purposes, some of the definitions are different depending on what government entity has has determined the definition. Okay, so the U.S. State Department defines terrorism in its Title 22 of the U.S. Code as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. So as we go on, keep in mind who the State Department might be dealing with when they use this definition to define terrorists. So the State Department is worldwide. So the State Department might be defining a group that's not within the United States, that might be in Syria, Lebanon, Argentina, it might be in another country. And so the State Department uses this definition to define groups, because the State Department puts up travel alerts for our citizens to travel to different places. So if there are groups operating in different parts of the world, this is the definition that the State Department uses to define what terrorism is. The FBI defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to indicate or coerce governments or societies, often to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives. So the FBI added that little caveat there about property. So as we saw in the previous lecture in part one, there are people in the United States, particularly animal rights groups, that are willing to attack property. And as we saw, we haven't talked about it, and it'll be part of the discussion for week 2. Dr. Vlasic and Mr. Coronado were the two main people that 60 Minutes highlighted in that video. So Dr. Vlasic is a classic extremist. He's an extremist. He has extreme beliefs, but he hasn't crossed a line that we know of. As opposed to Coronado, Mr. Coronado goes around and teaches people terrorist tactics, how to light fires, and how to terrorize groups that do experimentation on animals. But Mr. Coronado has crossed the line. He has actually been arrested. So these groups, and we saw how ineffective the FBI has been in trying to stop them. So they've been quite effective in their tactics, and so um, the FBI, in order to prosecute them, added property to their definition. So in the Department of Defense's military dictionary, they define terrorism as the calculated use of unlawful violence or threat of unlawful violence to inculcate fear intended to coerce or to intimidate governments or societies in the pursuit of goals that are generally political, religious, or ideological. So again, these definitions, part of it is the verbiage, that they use, and they not only describe the unlawful use of violence, but also the threat of violence. So the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, when they were operating throughout the 1970s in Northern Ireland and Britain, would often call in and make a bomb threat to a government building or to a civilian landmark. And so the threat alone, the British government would have to evacuate the building um, be ready for in the event that there was actually a bomb. Oftentimes, they would make a warning or a threat, and there really wasn't a bomb. But how can you tell? So it's that threat of violence that inculcates fear into the public, and that's what terrorists are looking to do. That's their ultimate goal. So many people in the United States have come up with a composite definition, and Mr. Martin uses this definition to describe and to define terrorism. And it's the premeditated and unlawful act in which groups or agents of some principle engage in a threatened or actual use of force or violence against human or property targets. These groups or agents engage in this behavior intending the purposeful intimidation of governments or people to affect policy or behavior with an underlying political objective. So that composite, and it appears that it was developed by academia because it covers every point or every act possible. And so, but in order to define terrorism, academia had to come up with a succinct definition, and that's pretty much the one that they've come up with. So if you're following along in the book, we're on probably around page 31. And on page 31, Mr. Martin gets into discussing the different types of terrorism. And a general consensus among experts about the types of terrorism are state terrorism, dissident terrorism, religious terrorism, criminal terrorism, and international terrorism. So these terms are not the same terms used by all different experts in the field. In fact, many books have different typologies of terrorism and include many different or use different verbiage to describe them. So Martin kind of came up with with these, which most types of terrorism do fall under one of these 5 categories. Okay, so state terrorism is committed by governments or their proxies directed against domestic enemies and or enemies abroad. Um, I don't know if the book he brings it up, but Nazi Germany, Hitler was a terrorized his own citizenry, particularly the Jewish community, Gypsies, and other non-German groups, and he terrorized them during World War II. Currently, some have alleged that Vladimir Putin in Russia terrorizes his own citizenry that go and that disagree with him. So that's up for debate. Um, Certainly, it's a possibility. Dissident terrorism is committed by subnational groups, for example, ethnic based or ideological organizations against the state. the Irish Republican Army had a long-standing war against the Great Britain during the 1970s and into the 80s. It's been argued that it was a religious war, religious terrorism, but it was a dissident group that was trying to have and the British government removed from Ireland. Religious terrorism is committed for the furtherance of a matter of religious faith, such as to fill a mandate from God. Again, we see ISIS and Al Qaeda. They are religious terrorist groups. They are fighting a fatwa against the West. They believe that the West is infidels and that they should conquer all of the West and that the whole world should become Islamic. We call it the Islamic Jihad. Criminal terrorism is committed for personal gain or profit, can be blended with more political varieties of terrorism. So the nexus between criminal groups and terrorism is a little more difficult to establish because of the profit part. Down in South America, in Colombia, the drug groups and the drug cartels certainly did use terrorism as a way to sway the public to their defense or to their side. In Italy, the mafia has infiltrated the government, and so although there is it is a form of terrorism, the nexus though is a little bit more difficult to prove or to ascertain because ultimately those groups are looking to profit. International terrorism is committed across state boundaries or a violent act that otherwise spills over, spillover terrorism into a more global setting. ISIS, right now, when an act occurs, they take responsibility for it. So whether it was directly from ISIS itself, if they planned it, or if it was a lone wolf, it's still spillover terrorism. It's international. The attack by Al Qaeda on the United States on September 11th was an international act of terrorism. And prior to that, several of their bombings in Northern Africa and in the Middle East were certainly international acts of terrorism. Okay, so now we're going to look at 4 perspectives on terrorism. There's 4 semi-famous quotations. We'll look at some of the participants in a terrorist environment, whether terrorism is actually that or freedom fighting, and we'll look at extremism or mainstreamism. I don't know if that's a word. It's in the book, so we'll have to accept it. The first quotation is probably one of the most overused quotations in describing terrorism, and it's one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. The author is unknown, and terrorists feel that their cause is just, so they depict themselves in heroic terms. Again, we've talked about it earlier that the term terrorist is a pejorative term, so rather than calling themselves a terrorist, they prefer to call themselves freedom fighters. And we will look at the origins when Israel was first declared to be a sovereign state in the late 1940s, and we'll look at some of the tactics that they used and how they call themselves freedom fighters, but in reality, most of the West declared or thought that they were actually terrorists. So we'll look at that as we go forward. But one man's terrorist, that is, it's a term that's generally been attributed whenever there's a definitional statement about terrorism. That quote is usually used, and again, it's a matter of perspective. So we have to be critical thinkers and look at the acts and the groups critically, all groups, and decide why one group feels, well, their condition, what causes them to become a terrorist or / freedom fighter, and what their background is for the group, how they originated and where they came from.
It was one of the most audacious acts of terror the world had ever seen. They used 350 kilos of gelignite and TNT, and they planted the bomb in broad daylight in a building full of people. Nearly 60 years on, and it is as fresh in the memory as ever for those involved.
I was running as fast as I could, with the bomb on my shoulder. There were a lot of explosives inside. It was heavy.
The bomb killed 91 people and 45 others were injured. But little did the bombers of Jerusalem's King David Hotel back in 1946 know that they were one day to be hailed as the founding fathers of a new age of terror. For their success inspired waves of imitators around the world.
If my sacrifice for that is to be called a terrorist, then I'm glad to have been a terrorist for liberation.
We didn't mind being called terrorists then, because we actually used force, such force, a brutal force, in order to get rid of them.
We knew we only had one chance in 1,000 of coming out alive, but death was around every corner.
This is the story of the birth of modern terrorism, of the activists who invented it, and of how it has been appropriated and dispersed around the globe. Jerusalem, cradle of faith to Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. Jerusalem, the birthplace of modern terrorism.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network. Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that, ahead of its time, in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state to rebuild the state which was existing many, many hundreds of years ago.
The bombing of the King David Hotel was perhaps one of the most significant terrorist incidents of the 20th century. For many decades, it actually held the infamous record of having killed the largest number of people.
In a fight for liberty, you have always those who are more, call them extreme, or more adamant, or call them staunch, and they want it immediately, not to wait for the Messiah.
Still lying under the shadow of terrorist attacks, many areas of Palestine are
By the end of World War II, the British, who had been made responsible for looking after Palestine by the old League of Nations 27 years earlier, found it to be a serious headache. They were caught in the middle of the Arabs and the Jews, both of whom wanted the country for their own, were unwilling to peacefully coexist, and were agreed on only one thing: their hatred of the British, whom they both saw as foreign occupiers. The British military and administrative headquarters was here, in the south wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The luxury hotel itself still functioned with guests, restaurants, bars, and Sudanese waiters.
Jerusalem at that time, it was a fortress. And I walk through the town and put in my mind every place and think about how can we attack this place. If we succeed, it's very important the whole world will see that we can fight even the British.
Begin and Ellis decided on a daring plan. They would strike at the very heart of British rule, the King David Hotel itself. If they succeeded here, the whole world would take notice. The terrorist's bomb was hidden in 7 milk churns and delivered in a hijacked pickup truck to the hotel's basement kitchen.
We jumped out, and everyone took up their positions. I took the churn and started to run. I was thinking, how do I get to the place where I have to put the churn down? That's how I started. Anyway, there were lots of people around in the corridor, and we tried to move them out of the way. Here, there, to the side. But there were some who resisted, but we threatened them with our weapons. I wasn't dressed as a civilian or a soldier. I was dressed like an Arab, with a jalaba and a keffiyeh, with that ring on your head. You know, like, what's he called? The leader of the Arabs. You know, Arafat. There were 7 churns, weighing 350 kilos in all. I ran until I reached the place where I had to put it down, with the churn on my shoulder. I carried on, until I got to the place where the British people were. I saw a pillar that used to be here, and I put the churn down and ran away immediately. I waited in my position until all the churns were together, and then the time would come for the explosion. All the churns together were like one whole man, a complete bomb.
The bomb went off at 12:37 and was devastating. But of the 91 dead, only 28 were British. 17 Jews died alongside 41 Arabs. Of all these, 54 were innocent civilians, unconnected to the British authorities in any way.
It's classic terror in that it's off the mainstream. It's not a reflection of the policies of the then Israeli leadership, which had a very strong ethical approach to the use of violence, admirable in many ways. And it shows too a sign of the future in that it's the damage being done by the splinter of the main movement, which is the damage we frequently call terrorist, and which is the most likely to be without any moral dimension.
Once more, the civilized world has received a rude shock at the hands of fanatics whose wanton act is contrary to the dictates of all creeds alike and imperils the best interests of the cause that it strives to promote.
The Irgun denied that they aimed at civilian targets, but one man at least had a different opinion. In 1948, the British Chief Secretary in Palestine, Sir Henry Gurney, wrote in his diary of how one Irgun attack was indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets and was designed to create panic among the population. 3 years later, Gurney himself was to be assassinated, as liberation movements all over the world took note of the flame that had been ignited in Palestine. By 1948, the British and the world community had lost their appetite for the fight against the Jewish terrorists, and the British abandoned Palestine, leaving Arab and Jew to fight it out amongst themselves. But elsewhere in their restless colonies, others had watched and learnt from the success of the Zionist terrorists.
Okay, so that previous video, a lot of folks are not aware about the incident that occurred in 1946 at the King David Hotel, and that's a British documentary. So the British are unabashedly unafraid to refer to it as a terrorist act. It was perpetrated by the Irgun, which was an Israeli organization early on that was fighting to have Israel become a free and autonomous state. And it mentions in, I'm not going to go on too much about the video because it says a lot of this stuff, but one of the leaders of the group eventually became the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. So, again, it's about perspective. So, as we move forward, keep that in mind, that sometimes groups start out as terrorist groups, and eventually they become legitimized and actually have become governments. agents in the government. But Begin was considered a terrorist. Eventually, he became a prime minister. So, again, it's about a little bit about perspective. The second quote is a Chinese quote from a Chinese philosopher, and it's one man willing to throw away his life is enough to terrorize 1,000. I guess we can use the suicide bomber as an example, although that wasn't the application in his quote, but certainly a suicide bomber, one person strapped with bombs or laced with shrapnel, can become a human weapon, and he will be enough to terrorize thousands of people. The third quotation is extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. And that was said by Barry Goldwater, and in the following clip we'll see him say it at the, I believe it's a 1964 Republican convention. One may believe a cause is so absolutely righteous that the ends justify the means. So Mr. Goldwater, he was a right-wing member of the Senate, and he ran for president in '64, and he was beaten pretty soundly by Lyndon Baines Johnson. But Mr. Goldwater makes Donald Trump seem like a bleeding-hearted liberal compared to him. He was an extreme right-wing candidate who advocated dropping the bomb in Southeast Asia to end the war. So this current president-elect is not the first time that we've had people or folks that are kind of extreme run for office or actually potentially hold office. The fourth quote, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it," originated in Vietnam, America's involvement in Vietnam, and destroying something denies the enemy the use of that asset. It symbolizes a victory of saving something by not allowing the enemy to use it. And we're not going to get into the history of the Vietnam War because that was a guerrilla war. But the United States would oftentimes, because the Viet Cong were an unseen enemy, oftentimes they would go into a village, and because the villagers were potentially sympathizers to the enemy, we would actually destroy the village, burn it down, so that the villages or the Viet Cong could not come back at night and utilize the village. So that became a form of terror because the Americans, we would terrorize the population by destroying their homes and villages in order to not give access to our enemy.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
So the first perspective that we looked at were the four quotations and the quotes from different perspectives to kind of describe terrorism. Now we're going to look at the perspective two, is the participants in a terrorist environment. And they are the terrorist, the supporter, the victim, the target, the onlooker, and the analyst. So in part three, we're going to look at perspective two, and we'll describe these folks a little bit more in part three. So I'll see you in a little while.